Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have known Dr. Amit Kapoor for a fairly long time, which means I know him better than you probably do, and therefore you should not believe everything that he says. Thank you, Amit, for the very, very kind invitation to come and talk to you this evening. It's going to be a little bit of an unstructured talk on my thoughts about where we stand in India, what is the status of development, and its flip side, deprivation. And that's particularly important because unlike some of the countries in the so-called developed world that you're familiar with, unlike some of those countries where much of Michael Porter's initial work was, where the emphasis of competitiveness was on individual enterprises, on markets, on how rival enterprises behave. Competition or competitiveness or its lack in India is still largely defined and shaped by the behavior of government policies. And most of the time, in your individual enterprises, you will discover that functioning in an Indian environment, most of the time what you are really managing is managing the government, at least historically. Having said that, when we think of the government in India, as everyone present here knows, but I just want to stress that, is a government at three different layers. There is an union government, there is a state government, and there are local governments. Also, the bedrock of everything that government in India does is the constitution, and the organs of state in that constitution are not merely the executive arm of the government, but also involve the judiciary and also involve legislature. In the case of union government, that's parliament. In the case of state governments, that happens to be state legislatures. See, if one is going to use the word government in a very, very broad sense, it means judiciary, it means legislature, and it also means the three layers of government in that executive sense, as in union government, state government, and local government. Governments historically have performed both a malign role and have performed a benign role. A malign role in terms of excessive government intervention in areas where government need not necessarily exist. That's what I mean by malign government. There are areas that government need not necessarily be in, and therefore it's a question of withdrawing from those areas subject to proper regulation existing. The withdrawal of government does not mean and cannot mean the absence of regulation. Because all said and done, competition defined in the textbooks of economics taught by Amit and me is a figment of the imagination. that perfect competition does not exist anywhere. The world is unfortunately a world of unfair trade practices. The world is one of restrictive business practices. The world is one where you need that regulation. Part of the time, I am not singling out anyone in this room, I am talking about people outside the room. Part of the time when individual companies come and approach the government, half the time perhaps they come and approach the government because of their legitimate entitlements. Half the time they approach the government so that the rules can be bent on their behalf, and so that the competition cannot have the same degree of access. That is the reason I am harping on this point of regulation. Of course, the dividing line between regulation and control is a very, very thin one. And quite often, licensing and control, at least historically, have been regarded as synonymous with regulation. Regulation means the content of regulation is important. Regulation means you need adequate regulators who possess the necessary expertise. Regulation also means a question about whether you want an across-the-board regulator like the Competition Commission of India, or because you require technical expertise, does one want sector-specific regulators? Amit mentioned the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, not the Mandukya Upanishad. He's vanished now, not the Upanishad. At that time, who do you think looked after unfair trade practices? Who looked after restrictive business practices? Who set MRP? The government did not do it. Individual industry organizations in the form of Srenis did that. The best English word for Srenis is guilds, although they were quite unlike the guilds of the West. Quite often, the reason government steps in is that regulation, which might very well have been done by industry bodies and industry associations, is absent and is missing, and therefore the government, sometimes unwillingly, is forced to step in. Let me now talk about the benign role of government. What do I mean by the benign role of government? There are certain goods and services we expect governments to deliver. That's the reason we elect governments in the first place across the world. We can have a debate in this room about what are the priorities for any government. And I'm using the word government in the sense of the singular right now, remembering, of course, what I said a little while earlier, that there's a three-tier structure. So governments is actually in the plural. But let's ignore that for a moment. We can have a debate in this room about what are the priority areas for the government. Which are the public goods and services that we want governments to deliver? Eventually, when I ask you to prioritize, you will all probably agree that the most important areas for governments to deliver public goods and services are, number one, law and order and security. Number two, some areas of physical infrastructure. where there are bound to be market failures. They may be electricity generation. They may be electricity distribution. They may or may not be electricity distribution. Did I say distribution just now? I meant transmission. They may or may not be electricity distribution, but certainly generation, transmission, rural roads, water supply, moving away from physical infrastructure, perhaps certain areas of social infrastructure, primary health centers in villages, schools in rural areas. I will carefully draw a distinction between government actually providing these and government not necessarily providing them, but financing them. In other words, I subsidize those who are below a designated threshold level of subsistence, but I leave them free to choose about which provider they should go to. However, these are areas you cannot expect the government to abdicate. It's been 7 decades since independence. Quite often, something that Gandhiji said is cited. And Gandhiji said, India lives, or dies actually, in her villages. This is an expression that is quoted all the time. Very few people remember what he said couple of sentences further down in the same paragraph. Because a couple of sentences further down in the same paragraph, where he said India dies in its villages, he also mentioned the number of villages that existed in India at that time. And the number of villages that existed in India at that time was 700,000. Over a period of time, villages disappear. There are various reasons why villages disappear over a period of time. Some get reclassified. Some, because of migration, become uninhabited. Some become assimilated into larger villages or even urban agglomerations. The number of villages in India today is 600,000. So compared to Gandhiji's time, 100,000 villages have vanished. Today there are 600,000 villages. 7 decades after independence, several of those villages, and when I say several, I do not mean a couple of thousand. About 100,000 of these villages lacked public goods and services that you and I take for granted. They did not have all-weather roads. They did not have electricity. They did not have LPG. Individual households did not have electricity connections. They did not have bank accounts. They did not have access to toilets. They did not have access to water. When one looks at this government, this particular government that came into being in May 2014, and I'm sure all of you read the pink papers, and the pink papers love labels. Is this government pro-market? Is this government anti-market? Is this government introducing big bang reforms? Is this government introducing small bang reforms? All of that is fine. And sitting in metro India, sitting in urban India, it is perfectly legitimate to complain. But all of us have different prisms. When you accuse this government, if you at all accuse this government of being anti-market, do remember there are those villages where the villagers are applauding the fact that now we finally have these public goods and services. To deliver these public goods and services, any government requires revenue. And there are only two sources of revenue. It can either be tax or it can be non-tax revenue. An invariable criticism about this government has been, why does it not do something about the central public sector enterprises which bleed money every day? Perhaps, and I'm not talking just about Air India. But let me remind you of something that may not be very obvious to you. That when I decide to sell off a public sector enterprise, and I'm talking about a central public sector enterprise, the largest value invariably comes from sales of land. The plant and machinery, the factory, whatever else, does not bring that amount of money. The largest value typically comes from sales of land. I'm sure you are not aware that an inventory of the land owned by the 230-odd public sector enterprises, central public sector enterprises, did not exist until 1.5 years ago. Until 1.5 years ago, one did not even know how much of land was held by these central public sector enterprises. I'm talking about all of them. For a few important ones you did know. When you have this inventory, you realize that most of this land is actually not owned by the central public sector enterprise, is actually owned by state governments. So when you decide to close down a central public sector enterprise, the land has to be first offered to the state government. Sometimes the land is for a specific purpose, and therefore it cannot be used for any other purpose. So there are all of these complications. On the tax part of it, I will only say the following. You may like GST, you may not like GST, you may not like the way GST has happened. There is the terminal goal about which there will not be a great deal of disagreement. The question is, should we have sat around and debated and tried to generate a consensus and then waited for another 20 years to proceed towards that GST? Or should one recognize that the GST that one has got is an imperfect one? Let us start with it and then we will tweak it as we go along. On that, different people can have different views, and this government decided that instead of hanging around and debating this for 20 years as we have done in the past 15 years, let us start and then we will tweak. On the direct tax side, I will only say that I'm sure several of you here want a reduction in the tax rates. A reduction in the tax rates, including in the paragraph where the finance minister first announced, pre-announced almost, a reduction in the tax rates, is linked to the removal of exemptions. Unfortunately, the attitude of most people, and I don't mean only on the corporate side, I also mean on the personal income tax side, is retain the exemptions for me, remove them from for everyone else. We want that, but we want the national highways that will rival the highways of Western Europe. We want the railways that will rival the railways of South Korea. We want the defense that will rival the defense capabilities of Israel, this, that, and the other. Notwithstanding and recognizing the fact that there are inefficiencies in public expenditure, you cannot have it both ways. The Indian Tax Gdp ratio today, union government plus state governments, is 17% of GDP. 5.5% of GDP is wasted on tax exemptions. We might still want those tax exemptions in terms of a collective consensus, but that's 5.5% of GDP that could be spent on something else. 17% of GDP, remember that. Many people have many priorities in terms of what the government should spend on. All kinds of people with interests in the social sector say 6% of GDP must be in the form of public expenditure on education. 4% must be in the form of health. That's 10%. 10% must be in the form of infrastructure. Are you adding? I hope you are. That's 20%. 3% must be in the form of defense. That's 23%. I've already exceeded that 17%. But let me not leave you with news that is entirely boring. So in the remaining 4 minutes, I will flag an interesting churn that is happening in India, and I will flag some excellent work that's been done by the Indian Competitiveness Forum, actually the Indian Institute for Competitiveness. Where is that? There it is, Institute for Competitiveness. When we look at India, we often tend to look at it in terms of what's happening in states. We tend to look at it in terms of what is happening in districts, because these are neat administrative boundaries. The interesting churn that is happening in India now is not just competition among states, but the great disparity among states and within states. Several of the states that historically were backward, according to whatever criteria you want to choose, are now fast catching up. The distance between them and the more advanced states historically may still be large, but because states like Punjab or Goa, they started with high base levels. Even more interesting is the fact that there are increasing variations within states. The Mumbai-Pune belt is not the same as what is happening in Vidarbha. And ditto for other parts. And one of the remarkable things that has been happening is this churn and the so-called backward villages in the backward districts catching up. I don't know whether you'll find this difficult to believe, but there are villages in India that have population sizes more than 50,000. I don't know whether you will find this easy to believe, but there are villages in India with population sizes of 10,000 which have better development indicators than towns with population sizes of 10,000. So what is exciting is this churn. And to try and understand India and what has been happening to development and deprivation in India, it is no longer enough to look at states. It is even more important to look at districts. It's no longer enough to look at it with this rural-urban prism, because within that rural-urban prism, things are changing and are changing very fast. I'm not saying Amit and his colleagues are the only ones who do work on such churn happening in India. There are others too. But these are the kinds of things you should be looking at, because they tell you a story about what has been happening in India, and what has been happening in India in the last several years is a structural change. And if one extrapolates the historical past, you will form a very inadequate comprehension of what has been happening in India. Thank you once again, Amit, for having invited me, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.